because you might think, what stops people from progressing in terms of the quality of their personality structure? And the answer to that is, well, every time you want to move forward, you have to let something go, and there's a disintegration associated with that, and so that's somewhat terrifying. It's like, maybe you find, well, the case of the abused spouse is a good one. Why go back to someone who abuses you? And people usually do. And well, and that's partly because, couples abuse each other all the time. So it's a matter of degree. But, if you go out on the spectrum to the point where it's pretty damn obvious that the abuse is criminal, let's say, because that's sort of the bordering line, people will still return. Well, why? It's a really hard question. Why? Sometimes it's because the abuser conspires to make sure that the abused person is in a position of such weakness that they actually can't leave. They have no money, they have no resources, and they're terrified. So, that's that aside. Well, what do you give up when you leave? Well, you give up everything. You give up your past, because you have to think, geez, that was a mistake. And that's going to require a lot of thinking through to figure out why you made that particular mistake and how not to make it again, because you probably will, because whatever got you into that situation to begin with is undoubtedly still there unless you fixed it. And then, of course, your future's shot, right? And so is your present self-image. And that's a chaotic collapse. It might mean that you have to move cities. God only knows. You have to change jobs. You have to change where you live. You have to change all your friends. It's like, is that better? Well, not obviously. And so people won't take the leap off the burning grasslands on the cliff into the water below. And it's not surprising, because who knows how many sharks are down there. And that it's really useful to understand it that way, I think, because it tells you why people won't transcend themselves constantly. It's like, well, you have to make a sacrifice. And, it's not always obvious that the gain you will make from the sacrifice is worth the costs of the sacrifice, and that's even in extreme conditions. And that's partly why Exodus is such an archetypal story. It's like, it's not obvious at all to the Israelites when they're out in the desert, wandering about, half starving, that it's only faith that keeps them going, faith that there might be something better at the other end. It's like, well, so what happens is that they get pretty damn crabby at Moses for leading them out there, and they start to worship all sorts of alternative gods, which is exactly what you do when you're in chaos, by the way. Because when you're in chaos, you're looking for new moral principles to orient yourself by, and those are new hierarchies of value, and to think about those as alternative structures of dominant structures of value that could be represented by a given deity, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, especially in the absence of articulated knowledge of what a moral structure is. It's a perfectly reasonable way to represent it. So that happens. So the Israelites are trying to orient themselves on this trip. They don't know what the hell they're doing. And then another thing happens that's quite interesting is that, well, they're all squabbling among each other. Now, I want to tell you a story about that. So among the Bushmen, the Kalahari Bushmen, who, by the way, look to be the most genetically similar of all human beings to what our earliest relatives would have been who moved out of Africa. It's something like that, so that's kind of interesting. The Kalahari Bushmen are a very egalitarian society. And people like to think that egalitarian societies, because they're egalitarian, are peaceful, but that's not true at all. They're not peaceful at all, and neither is the Bushman Society. And the problem with the Bushman Society is that, let's say, I don't know, you steal my wife. Okay, well, there's no hierarchy, so what am I going to do about that? There's no authority to appeal to, so I'm stuck with it. So what am I going to do? Well, often I'm just going to wait around until I get my chance, and then I'm going to take out my little bow and arrow with my poison arrow, and I'm going to nail you with it. Because what else is there? There's no authority. Now, this is what the Bushmen do, very interesting, is that there's another tribe located near them, and I think it's the Bantu, but I'm not absolutely certain, but I think it's the Bantu, and they have a hierarchical structure. So there is an authority, and so now the Bushmen will go to the Bantu to have their disputes mediated so they don't just have to shoot each other when they have an argument. So it's quite interesting. It's worth thinking about, because in a flat egalitarian society, nobody has the final word. And when everyone's getting along, that's perfectly fine. But as soon as two people aren't getting along, it's like, who do we turn to mediate this? Okay, so the Israelites had that problem in the archetypal story, and so what happens in relationship to Moses is that every time two Israelites have some squawk about whose chicken is whose, they have to come to Moses and they pour out their tale of woe, and he has to sit there and listen to it, and then he has to decide who's right. Now, so he's serving as a judge. Now you got to think, what are you doing when you're judging? Which is a word that's, people say, well, don't judge me. It's like, really? It's like, that's the same as not thinking. Judging is actually an extraordinarily useful ability because it helps you separate out what isn't good for anything from what's valuable. It's like, it isn't absence of judgment you want, it's judicial judgment, right? Principled judgment. And then you might say, well, what is that? Well, that's a good question. You could say, well, it's all arbitrary anyways. Well, then you've just got chaos, so that's not much of a solution. Okay, so the Israelites are coming to Moses like non-stop, bitching about these little trivial things that are aggravating them to death. And he's sitting there like for years, literally for years, listening to them like 14 hours a day. And finally, he does this so long that I think it's his father-in-law who tells him he has to stop and distribute the responsibility because he's just going to get exhausted. But you can imagine what happens to you if you sit there and judge and judge and judge and judge and judge and judge and judge, is that you're building up a very articulated and differentiated representation of the moral structure that actually constitutes your society. Because imagine if you're a good judge, here's what has to happen. You two are at each other's throats, like in a really homicidal way. So things have gone too far. And so then I have to listen to you both, and I have to decide what you're going to do. But I have to do something even more spectacular than that. I have to decide it in a way that you both feel is more acceptable than killing each other. And that means you have to feel that not only is it reasonable and just, it also has to absolve you of your responsibility to seek revenge. Because that's one of the functions of law that people never think about. It's like,